is quite the opposite of the truth. In fact, it seems to me that President Trump rejecting the deal on offer was better for him than accepting, well, not just any deal, I mean, not just a bad deal, but also any deal in a way. It certainly helped him to look like he understood the process going on better than he had done previously. There had been a lot of talk before the summit, fear that President Trump would accept any old deal that the North Koreans were offering, and that this would be very deleterious to relations with South Korea, it would be deleterious to conditions in Northeast Asia. None of these things happened, of course, as a result of President Trump's rejection of the deal. As an aside, you could argue that Chairman Kim also benefited from not accepting the deal, insofar as it may give him a little bit of leverage with certain factions inside the North Korean ruling elite that do not support the idea of embracing a change in the relationship between North Korea and the United States. Of course, evidence in this regard is somewhat limited, and so that must remain at the level of speculation. In any case, these three misunderstandings were all dealt with, as it happens, in a briefing paper put out by Crisis Group in late December, where we proposed a modest deal that would generate momentum for the dialogue process, leading to, we hoped, greater successes later in 2019 and into 2020. Indeed, our modest proposal was the polar opposite of President Trump's go big or go home approach, for precisely the reasons that I just mentioned. The misunderstandings are born of a failure to recognize what kind of situation North Korea is in, and from North Korea's perspective, a failure to recognize the situation the United States is in. But in any case, our December modest proposal suggested exchanging the Yongbyon complex, now the definitional questions, of course, need to be dealt with, but the Yongbyon complex broadly for restarting the Kaesong industrial complex, for potentially restarting inter-Korean tourism, and for potentially allowing infrastructure development funded by South Korea, conducted largely by South Korea, but in partnership with North Korea. We proposed this modest deal, partly, of course, with a view to North Korea's needs, but also with a view to the political economy of South Korea. There is going to be a report in more depth on that very subject coming out from Crisis Group in just a little while. But for the time being, we were thinking of the deal in the context of the Moon administration in South Korea's need to achieve not only peace and reconciliation with ethnic brethren and these kinds of important but only partial reasons for engaging North Korea, but also to achieve economic benefits, the kind of which would allow the Moon administration to sustain its engagement with North Korea through tougher times. Not allowing any economic engagement with North Korea, not allowing any sanctions relief prior to full denuclearization, which was, of course, the US position, the maximalist position put forward by the US earlier in 2018, though I'm thankful to say since ameliorated, does not take into account South Korea's position, of course. It doesn't take into account South Korea's need to bring along for the ride those groups in South Korean society for whom peace and reconciliation with North Korea are not as important as achieving certain economic goals. So that's why we put forward our modest proposal. In light of North Korea's proposed deal in Hanoi, and in light of President Trump's proposed deal in Hanoi, our modest proposal looks extremely modest indeed. And so therefore, I think we may have to work to meet in the middle, as it were, seek some consensus in this regard. If North Korea is looking for 5 full sets of sanctions imposed since 2016 to be removed, then I suspect the Kaesong industrial complex and some inter-Korean tourism isn't going to cut it. But that is something to consider for the future. Now, I know Joel and Jenny will speak at more length about this, but the situation we appear to be in now, at least today, is that the news cycle is dominated by the apparent efforts of North Korea to rebuild or remodel its Sohae satellite launch station at Tongchang-ri. Why is North Korea doing this? I think this is an important question for journalists in the room. All of the hot take analysis was that a test may be impending, but fortunately a test of a missile or a satellite launch or something of this nature may be impending. But, as Joel can attest to with a great deal more confidence than I can, that is highly unlikely. Rather, I would point you to the Pyongyang Declaration signed by Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in September of last year, in which, in Article 5, the two sides stated that North Korea will, quote unquote, permanently dismantle the Dongchang-ri missile engine test site and launch platform under the observation of experts from relevant countries. That's citing the English translation. The point here is that that section of Article 5 is in the same article as when North Korea vowed to demolish the Yongbyon nuclear complex as long as the United States takes reciprocal steps. In essence, I think North Korea is saying to us, hey, you like all of that inter-Korean military cooperation we've got going on. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it. This is my, to sort of quote films of yore, that is my feeling about how North Korea is softly putting pressure on the United States and South Korea to think hard about the situation that they find themselves in post-Hanoi. What is the answer? What is the response to this state of affairs? The answer, I think at least, is to, and this was what we were hoping to do anyway, of course, restore talks and seek some kind of mutually acceptable deal based on a more holistic analysis of the three actors, the three main actors, South Korea, North Korea, the United States, positions, a better understanding, a less historically illiterate understanding of North Korea's position in the world since the 1990s. And, of course, our rapidly advancing knowledge of the North Korean economy. We now know so much more about the North Korean economy than we knew 15 years ago, much of it thanks to the work of people like Jenny. If we are to remove sanctions going past, hypothetically going past simply the Kaesong Industrial Complex or inter-Korean tourism, then it will be necessary to remove them on a sectoral basis. Removing 5 full sets of UN sanctions at once is obviously impossible. And North Korea was, I think it fair to say, never going to get that deal in Hanoi. We know that the North Korean economy, we know which sectors are more dominated by military actors. We know which sectors are more dominated by, for want of a better word, civilian actors, and I don't think that is the appropriate term in North Korea, but non-military, non-intelligence services. We know that seafoods and coal, for example, are quite heavily dominated by military actors. We know that, for example, the textiles trade is less dominated. Of course, these distinctions are not hard and fast, but my point is to say we may wish to consider re-engaging with North Korea and having a discussion about the possibility of sectoral sanctions relief over a prolonged period of time. So anyway, at this point, I think the need, and of course it is what North Korea wanted by demonstrating its willingness to rebuild the Sohae Satellite Launch Center, the need is to, of course, re-engage, to start this conversation at the working level, and to see if we can achieve a slightly less modest, but still modest deal with North Korea that allows us to carry dialogue forward through 2019 and 2020. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joel. Over to you.
Hi. Thank you. Let me just add a few random points to this. I think the issue is really, at this point, what's the process going forward here? You know, as a former negotiator, I can see on the table lots of different potential deals, and, you know, I'm not going to start outlining them, but the issue becomes, what is the process going forward? What is the degree of patience on both sides to work through that process? And, you know, is this beginning now, this move at Sohae, just part of the bargaining process, or can it become the end of this whole effort to negotiate a denuclearization deal. First, on what's going on at Sohae, yes, Chris has said, there's been this fever in the press that, oh my God, this is going to be a test. We are far away from any sort of test here, and certainly not an ICBM test, which one person said commenting to NBC News. This is a space launch facility. It's not a place where they launch ICBMs. We're not even near that yet. They have to rebuild what they're rebuilding now. That may not take a long time, but then in order to move from that point to an actual test, it could take up to 2 weeks or so. So we may be at the beginning of that process, or they can stop anywhere along that time frame. Secondly, I'm not incredible. I couldn't have predicted this was going to happen, but I'm not, totally surprised by it, because I think from the North Korean perspective, they're dismantling or starting to dismantle this facility, and also their partial destruction of the Punggye-ri nuclear test site was above and beyond the call of duty. They don't do that kind of thing, really. They wait to get deals before they do that. So I'm not surprised that they're sort of moving back in the opposite direction. And indeed, given my past experience, I'm sure the North Korean personnel at both places have contingency plans for doing exactly what they're doing now. So someone probably said, put your contingency plan into place. Beyond that, one other thing I wanted to mention in this context, in thinking about how this might escalate, just a thought, rather than a space launch coming up in 2 weeks where they put another satellite into space or something that drastic, one thing they could do, which would send a really strong signal, but fall short of that, would be to do a rocket engine test. One of the 2 places they're rebuilding is the rocket engine test facility. They could do that. It would fall way short of sending a space launch vehicle into space, but of course it would send a much stronger signal to everyone. I really can't predict where this is going, and this is part of the joy of dealing with North Koreans. You don't know whether this is a bargaining process and a tactic, or whether someone has made a decision that we're really going to move forward now on this opposite track. Of course, we should be watching the North Korean media and what they're saying, and any other tea leaves we can read. I think there are a number of important events coming up in North Korea. I guess there's a 14th Party Congress coming up the end of this month or in early April. I don't know how it's playing into that either. So last point here on the degree of patience on both sides, and this is something I am sort of struggling with and I find interesting. Of course, we have a president who's not noted for patience. He's very impatient. And of course, we don't know a lot about Kim Jong-un. We know some things about him. But one thing Jenny and I have heard from North Koreans is Kim Jong-un has a favorite saying, which is, let's take a shortcut. I'm not sure he's a very patient guy either. And so I wonder, having this combination of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, how combustible can that really get? And what's going on at Sohae feels to me like someone said, let's take a shortcut. They didn't like the slow pace of the negotiations. I think this work started before Hanoi collapsed. And certainly Hanoi would have reinforced that feeling that things are moving too slowly, and this may be an effort to speed it up. Whether it has that effect or not, I don't know. I mean, a lot depends on how the U.S. reacts to what's going on. And we just have to wait and see. But the danger here is that we could start spiraling downward as each side takes steps that undermine the process that's been in place since last spring. So let me stop there, and I'll turn to Jenny.
Thank you.
Sorry,
No, that's great. Pass the baton.
Great. So I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that Joel was talking about in terms of kind of how the North Koreans probably view the measures they've taken at Punggye-ri, the nuclear test site, and at Sohae. I was on Twitter this morning having a discussion with Bob Manning, and this topic came up of, the U.S. had suspended military exercises, so North Korea, they did these small things, and it still wasn't enough. And I think it's important to understand, though, how the North Koreans are likely viewing these actions. And so when it comes to the suspension of military exercises, this was a exchange for the moratorium on nuclear missile testing. So, if you're talking about the measures that they took at Punggye-ri and Sohae, these were above and beyond what that freeze for freeze understanding really was, and posed as a unilateral measure to help build the right momentum for the political process. The problem is that in that meantime, they started to do the dismantlement work. We watched it on satellite imagery. It stalled around August when the talks started to stall. And what you saw then was sort of a series of actions by the United States that were not in the same vein. So you saw them renew the travel ban of U.S. citizens traveling to North Korea. You saw the imposition of more and more sanctions on North Korean companies and individuals. You saw essentially the cut of humanitarian assistance to North Korea, and again, the champion of the maximum pressure policy. So I think if you're North Korea looking at this situation, you're thinking, I went above and beyond what it was we were, even agreed to do in this sort of freeze for freeze arrangement. And the response that we got, the reciprocation that we got, was the opposite of what would be useful to the process. I do agree with Chris that I think, what we should have had as a modest deal going into Hanoi, now without that, is the price is going to go up. And I think, we are probably looking at, instead of exemptions to allow inter-Korean projects to move forward, starting to look at sectoral sanctions, and if there are specific sectors, not all of them like the North Koreans wanted, but if there are specific sectors that there is room for movement on, I think it would now work to that level. I have to say, personally, I found the summit very disappointing, and for a number of reasons. And I think one, it was disappointing to know how far away we were in the understanding of getting an agreement going into the summit, because it did seem that we were close to having the outline of a deal that Chris talked about. So, it does seem, we're obviously still piecing together what happened, and it does seem that the North Koreans, or that both sides decided to up the ante while they were in Hanoi. The North Koreans, came with this bigger ask on the sanctions removal. I think it sounds like the U.S. then countered with a little bit bigger ask of, you have to add, if you want these sectoral changes, then you have to add more than just Yongbyon. And then President Trump came in and sort of went all in and said, well, why don't you just give us everything and we can lift everything. My fear is that we are now to a point where we're back to this all or nothing approach. And so for a lot of the people who had criticized that Trump is he's so desperate for a deal, he'll take a bad deal. They're very happy that he didn't take a bad deal. They're very happy we didn't get a deal. And now we're back to we have to negotiate the whole plan all at once before we can start moving. And I think, this is the approach that we've always sort of veered towards, and has always failed in that process, because you have two mutually distrustful actors. And so the idea that you can even envision what the end of that road is quite yet and how you're going to phase it out in a comprehensive way, there's just no faith that you're even going to get to that point, I think, on either side. And I think that's why this interim deal was such an important deal to get on paper, even if it wasn't perfect. But the idea to be able to get something that you could start to implement and start to build a track record of success and start to build trust over time, in order then to give momentum back to the negotiation process to get to the harder issues. And so we have lost that moment, and I'm afraid now with all of the post-summit posturing back and forth, it might take us a while to get back to even working level negotiations. And as Joel talked about, we can see this already starting to spiral downwards with statements from Bolton, and again, all of the punditry coming out saying now we have to do everything. And obviously North Korea restarting, rebuilding the Sohae satellite launching station, the launch pad and the engine test stand. These are all contributing to a more negative political environment. I think obviously this opens up a big role for Moon Jae-in. And obviously President Moon has a big stake in all of this. And I think, there's a lot of people looking to him now to kind of come and save this negotiation process. But I'm afraid I'm a bit more skeptical too on even how much he can do at this point. Because I think obviously he'll try to salvage the process, but he has a credibility problem now too. And so what you had when this whole process started was basically, President Moon assuring Kim Jong-un that he had the persuasive power to bring the U.S. along. He was very successful at first, getting President Trump to actually agree to a summit, and unconditional agreeing to a summit. You saw him even salvage that first summit when President Trump had first canceled it, being able to have the short, quick meeting between Kim and Moon to get the summit back on track and to pull both sides back together. But what you've had since then now is you've had the Panmunjom Declaration, you've had the Pyongyang Declaration, you've had parts of those declarations that have been implemented, especially on the military side of stuff. But the parts that the North Koreans really care about is on the economic side. So, what Moon Jae-in has been unable to do is, after the Panmunjom Declaration had come out and said he was going to ensure that there was an end of war declaration before the end of the year, which obviously didn't happen, and is still now in contention, and had put in both of these agreements the intent to reopen inter-Korean economic cooperation projects, which again has not been allowed to move forward, has not been able to move forward because of sanctions in place. So I think, part of what makes the rebuilding of Sohae so contentious now is that it also goes against Moon Jae-in. So this was in the Pyongyang Declaration. It was, never codified on the U.S. side, but it was something that they put in there as to here are the steps that we need to take in order to build the right environment to keep going. For the North Koreans now to reverse that decision, not only, I think, signifies that they're frustrated with the U.S. side of the equation, but I think it also shows a lot of frustration with the South Korean side of the equation, and is really a message to both of them that, the patience on the North Korean side is just as short as it is on the U.S. and the South Korean side as well. I would say, I think, as long as North Korea refrains from overtly provocative behavior going forward, such as nuclear testing, missile testing, and hopefully rocket testing as well, I think they will maintain the political relationships that they've started to rebuild, especially in Southeast Asia, in China, Russia, regaining their old traditional friends, despite what the U.S. might do going forward. But I do worry now, if things start to unravel, how this plays into designing U.S. policy for the next administration, because now we're in campaign mode. You have, all the Democratic candidates for president starting to put their hat in the ring. They'll be starting to formulate their policies. There's a lot of, this was an unconventional approach to begin with. If they had come away from Hanoi with an agreement to show that this process can work, as it has in the inter-Korean process, I think there would have been a lot of room for people to sort of hedge their policies to say, hey, maybe this can work, maybe we can move forward, maybe we should continue this. There might have been a more sustainable kind of approach, or more consistent approach to keep the momentum going. What I'm afraid of now is that you have a lot of people that their default policy is anti-everything Trump is doing now, which will also translate on the North Korea policy as well. He tried this, it was an unconventional approach, it was kind of haphazard, it didn't work, we can't make that same mistake again. And then you'll go back to this traditional approach of we need to get everything all up front. So this might have really deep implications for U.S.-North Korea relations, not only for the end of this administration, but for the next administration as well. On that bright note, I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. You've all given us a lot to think about and talk about. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question before I throw it open to everyone else. Chris, imagine you are President Trump. Joel, you're Chairman Kim, and Jenny, you are President Moon. Considering the interests and goals that each of you separately have, your own interests, regardless of the others, what is your very next move and why? And President Moon, the floor is yours first.
Oh, me. Well, obviously, I want to get both sides both the U.S. and North Korea back to the table as soon as possible, because the more time that passes, the more potential there is, for this downward spiral to happen. I'm obviously very frustrated because this really, hampers and hinders the plans that I have in place if I'm President Moon as to, the economic cooperation benefits not only for the inter-Korean relationship, but also for the South Korean economy. And so I'm trying to find ways I think now we're in Plan B mode of if the inter-Korean economic cooperation can't move forward, you saw recent news where there's a greater emphasis now on the Southern Plan, looking at India, increasing trade with India and South Asia. And so, I think there is a sense of urgency to try and mediate the US-DPRK process. Like I said, I haven't had a lot of luck as of late. So, at some point, you have to come to terms with, what happens if that doesn't happen, where else can we divert attention to deal with the issues that are also on the South Korean domestic agenda, and especially the economic side of stuff.
Good. Chairman Kim?
Oh, jeez. Going through all the media stuff in these meetings, I've never had that question. So now I have to figure that one out.
I did not give them advance notice.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess I would continue down this road, finish the restarting of the Sohae facility. I might even test the rocket engine. I might even have guys moving around a lot at Punggye-ri, the nuclear test site, and set off alarms on that. At the same time, I would consult with other countries. I guess Chairman Kim I guess there was talk in the media he's going to Russia. I might go to China again. I would send the message, what's up with Trump? You know, I'm really trying, but he's not really paying attention. He's not being coherent. He's being Trump. At some point, I would call for another summit also with President Trump. And that might be a little bit of a risk because it might not turn out that well, but I think Kim Jong-un is committed to this path and wants to play it out. And if he feels that's the way to get a deal, he'll do it that way. And one of the things I wonder about on the North Korean side is it's not just the Americans who appear a little bit disorganized. You know, I'm sort of puzzled by how the North Koreans are handling these negotiations. Everyone says the North Koreans they want to deal with Trump directly because they think they can get a better deal. Well, I guess that's not the case now, but that's what everyone was saying before the summit. And I'm puzzled by the different North Korean entities involved in this negotiation, ranging from Kim Young-chol, who seems to be the guy in charge, and then there are the foreign ministry people, Madam Chae, Ri Young-ho, and then there's another lower level guy who's working for Kim Young-chol, but actually seems to have more independence. And it's very confusing for me what's going on in terms of their formulating, negotiating positions. So there may be a problem there too. But I think that's basically the approach I would take if I was him.
President Trump?
Well, President Trump has a problem. I mean, more than one, I would argue. Ideally, what we would want him to do is to open the door to talks quite clearly, leave it open, to reaffirm his faith in Special Representative Steve Biegun, who is getting excellent reviews for being well up to speed on the issues, and for being a decent negotiator, although the way things turned out in Hanoi obviously raises some questions on that. The problem is, of course, that President Trump has other arguably bigger domestic fish to fry, bigger problems, and that these may play a role in his decision-making on the North Korea issue. So whether we get him doing the best that he can to try and help this process along, or simply making bold statements that have domestic resonance but actually negatively undermine the negotiating process is a good question, and it remains to be seen. The person, of course, that we also need to mention, and I'm subverting your question, I apologize here, is Xi Jinping. China is obviously the elephant in this room that no one has mentioned at all. It is interesting to note that, and I don't know what this means necessarily, but when Chairman Kim went to Hanoi, he crossed the border, he went to Tianjin, he moved south by train. He didn't go with the same locomotive all the way. At points on the way, his locomotive was changed. I don't know why, but it was. And then his original locomotive, the famous green locomotive, the one that brought him from Pyongyang, went to Beijing and was seen in Beijing. And it remained in Beijing until he left Hanoi, which raises the question of whether there had been a meeting planned in Beijing in the event of a successful summit with President Trump. Maybe that meeting was cancelled. Why, I don't know. Again, I'm just simply telling you what I'm aware of, the facts I'm aware of. You have to interpret them as you wish. But it could be that China's role is going to be increasingly important going forward. So one other thing I would hope President Trump would do would be to get on the phone to President Xi, who is, of course, involved in major political activities in China too, right? The major meetings going on in Beijing. We can't assume necessarily that the Sohae story is all about signaling to Washington, although, of course, a large part of it is that. You also may want to be sending a message if you are Chairman Kim, and I hate to tread on your toes as Chairman Kim, but you may, if you're Chairman Kim, want to send a message to Beijing as well.
And the message is, don't forget about us while you're distracted with other things.
Absolutely, we're still here, yes.
Could I add one point?
Sure.
You know, I've been engaged in research for over a year on a book project on Obama, President Trump, and North Korea. And one of the things and a lot of it is interviews. I've done almost 200 interviews. And one of the things I find really striking is that this is counterintuitive, but I think President Trump has been thinking about a deal with North Korea almost since the transition period and his meeting with President Obama. And you can see elements of that all along, as well as, you know, all the other stuff that comes with President Trump. So the issue is, even now, after everything that's happened, how committed is he to getting that deal? And is that initial impetus that I think was very strong after that Oval Office meeting, how is that dissipating, and how will the domestic situation affect him? And as we all know, President Trump seems to be immune to a lot of domestic criticism, but I think it's not clear to me whether that's the case anymore, particularly on this issue, because I see part of the outcome of Hanoi as him basically saying, I'm getting all this flack for Singapore, I'm going to hang tough this time around, and it actually helps me domestically if I walk away. And indeed, a lot of Democrats praised him for walking away. So this is not a good situation to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it probably depends on whether the goal is a deal or a process that eventually leads to a deal. And the impulse to have a deal, is that realistic?
Yeah, well, in the course of these interviews, someone told me who worked with President Trump that his idea of a deal isn't really our idea of a denuclearization deal. His idea of a deal is like what happened in Singapore. You have 3 or 4 principles, and that's a deal. So, you know, there are a lot of different currents here that it's hard to put them together into a coherent picture.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open it up to everyone. We've got a microphone. We're live streaming, so I think it's important to talk into the microphone. If you could please identify, we've got 2 microphones. If you could please identify yourself by name and affiliation if you have one, and be as brief as possible. In the back, yes.
Stephen Costello with the Korea Times. Question Joel about negotiating tactics. I just wonder if it's ever a good idea, particularly now in the wake of this, whether one of the parties would put out a more public position. You know, a lot of what we're struggling with now is that even on the U.S. side and North Korean side, we do not know very critical details. Timelines, we don't know if the U.S. ever came back and said, well, if we don't give you all 5, how about if we give you 3 of these? We know nothing about this. And we probably won't, because we cannot trust either of our governments in some sense. So the question is simply, would it be wise for one of the parties to put out something publicly and get behind it? Perhaps the only example of this in the recent past was the Chinese for a couple of years putting out this freeze for freeze idea, which was in some ways partly adopted. But I'd be interested to hear anyone's reply to this. Thanks.
You know, I don't think it's useful to bargain in public. And so I think we've pretty much gotten everything we're going to get in terms of each side's positions coming out of Hanoi. And it's okay to send signals, but I wouldn't do it publicly in detail. I think what needs to be done is, of course, privately, we need to re-engage as quickly as possible. And if we're going to do things publicly, we should be doing positive things, not engaging in a back and forth argument over each side's position and whether it's right or not.
Okay. Gentleman here, if you could just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Rich Cronin from Stimson. Joel, in particular, since you negotiated, I mean, you were involved in the negotiations of a real denuclearization agreement, which was the agreed framework in '94. At what point do we just, can those of us who are outside this process assume that the emperor has no clothes? That is, there will never be a real denuclearization of North Korea for a whole lot of reasons, which we'll go through. And the question is then, two questions. Where is the center of gravity of U.S. strategy making with regard to North Korea, to this issue, and the engagement with the president on our strategy? And second is for all of you, I mean, what can the U.S. do to actually get talks started again in terms of the U.S. initiative? Is there anything out there that would be reasonable for us to put on the table to get Kim back to negotiations? Thank you.
On your first question, it's not going to be wrapped up nicely in a bow. We have a denuclearization deal. It's never going to happen that way. It's going to be messy, and it's going to take a long time, and positions will shift over time. So initially, it may be very vague. As the process moves forward and there's progress, this is, of course, the theory for the case. If the process moves forward and there's progress, sides' positions can shift. So the North Koreans may start out saying, well, gee, we want to be really vague about denuclearization just to hedge our bets. But if the process moves forward and there's progress, at some point the North Koreans might say to themselves and to us, gee, let's make this more specific. And they'd say to themselves, we don't need nuclear weapons anymore because this hostile relationship has gone away. So I don't have a problem without having, people have made a big point of, well, we don't have this agreed definition of denuclearization. We should have some definition, but I don't have a problem if it's not, on 100 pages in black and white. And secondly, and then I'll shut up, this is one of the disturbing things I find, is that I thought, and I was probably too optimistic, which is not usually the case, I was too optimistic going into the summit that a decision-making process seemed to be in place, which was Steve Biegun, Secretary Pompeo, and the president. And it seems that that's not the case, that John Bolton is still in the picture. And I wonder whether it's going to ever be possible to get a deal with that kind of decision-making process. Because the only way the Bush administration was able to move forward during its second term in dealing with North Korea was cutting out all the people like the vice president and others and having a decision-making process of President Bush, the Secretary of State, and Chris Hill. That's what's needed here, and I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Jenny or Chris, do you want to add anything to that? Take another question. Woman here.
Hi, my name is Tomoko Beck from Nippon TV. The North Korean brief done on the midnight was held by Lee Foreign Minister and Madam Chair. Do you see that meaning something because it was not done by the Biegun's counterpart, or the Kim Yeon-chol? Some people say that might mean some kind of personnel shuffle that will be done by Kim Jong-un in the future. Also, do you see the position of Pompeo might be in danger just because he's atop of the diplomatic process, that he is the one who needs to be prepared for summit preparation? Do you see the future personnel shuffle or change in the future before the next possible summit? Thank you.
Chris, do you want to comment on the North Korean piece of this?
Sure. I mean, I don't know anything about the fate of Secretary Pompeo, so I'll leave that to one side. But my understanding from being in Hanoi at the time of that late-night press conference, if you saw President Trump's press conference earlier in the day, it was President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, right? The two people who came out and gave the press conference in the evening now, I know that, Joel, you commented that Madame Jae can be quite, hard? Was that the word you used?
Prickly.
There we are. So it's not as if the North Koreans were putting forward their very softest face, but still they were putting forward the diplomatic side of their delegation, and I think that's just the way that we need to view it. I mean, Foreign Minister Ri is obviously quite erudite, cosmopolitan character, can interact very easily and smoothly with the international media, and that's the perspective that I was seeing that from. It was interesting that Madame Che's comments in particular focused on the feeling she got of the disappointment Chairman Kim felt, right? So she wasn't saying Chairman Kim is really angry or anything like that. She was saying, I sensed that he was disappointed. Just putting out this tentative pressure that he gave that impression to her, but not putting words in his mouth. So it's as if Chairman Kim hasn't yet actually himself said anything on the matter.
I would just add to that. I think it would have been stranger if Kim Yong-chul or Kim Hyuk-chul had done it, because I mean this is sort of the role of the foreign ministry, is to interact with the public, and so it makes perfect sense that Ri Yong-ho was the one to do the briefing. It was interesting that Chae Sun-hee took questions and answered questions. But you know, I wouldn't read too much into it in terms of what does this mean of jurisdiction of where these negotiations go or who the interlocutors are going to be, because I don't think you can from just that press briefing.
You asked about Secretary Pompeo, and does this mean he's in danger of losing his job? It would be hard to make that leap of faith. I think he and Steve Biegun had a certain position going into this discussion. It was essentially, you know, step by step, arms control, arms reduction, phased approach to dealing with North Korea. And John Bolton had a different approach. And it seems like Pompeo and Biegun really didn't win. But Secretary Pompeo seems to be very adept at dealing with his boss. So I would really seriously doubt whether this damages him in any way.
Great. In the front.
Thank you. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And I'm also organizing a few civil society delegations to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference next month from Transcend International and Mediators Beyond Borders. So just two questions. You know, there's a focus on denuclearization and the weapons themselves, and I have a strong impression that while people are more dangerous and they're afraid and backed into a corner and isolated, and I think Kim Jong-un was more of a threat before, but now he's out and he's meeting with Xi, and I think that he's less of a pariah. So, you know, maybe some emphasis on the relationship in addition to just the weapon themselves, and also reference to the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty. And also, just what about Article 6? Because we have, you know, I mean, there's some irony that, you know, no one else can have nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapon states still haven't complied with Article 6 of the NPT, of the commitment to negotiate in good faith towards disarmament.
Yeah, I would just add, to underscore the first question, I also have wondered whether there's any value in analytically trying to distinguish between reducing risk by reducing capability versus reducing risk by reducing inclination to use the capabilities. Is that useful in any way? Anyone want to go first? Joel?
On that particular issue, I think part of everyone, certainly in the media, made fun of President Trump when he said, oh, the danger of there's no more danger of nuclear war. Everyone, and I assume he must know, that North Koreans still have nuclear weapons. They still have missiles. I think what he was talking about was exactly that the relationship, the tenseness of 2017 is basically dissipated and gone away. So it's the political side of things that he was talking about, and I think that goes to what you're talking about there. In terms of the emphasis on the relationship, that's what this is all about. A lot of it is about the relationship between the United States and North Korea, and nuclear weapons are a manifestation of that relationship, which hasn't been good for 60 years. So when you talk to a North Korean, and you've probably seen this in the press, and they want to end the hostile relationship. That's where peace treaty comes in, peace declaration, that's where liaison offices come in, that's where lifting sanctions come in. It's economic, but it's also political. So it's tightly integrated into this process. It's not as if it's not part of the process.
And the question about NPT in particular, anyone want to take that?
Well, prior to doing that, I wanted to also add that it's not simply enough to talk about enmeshing the United States and North Korea and improving the situation such that nuclear use becomes completely implausible, but also achieving the same thing with relations on the Korean Peninsula, achieving the same thing involving China and states on the Korean Peninsula, requires a lot more than the sort of linear, either a reciprocal process, sure, but in any case, a linear process between the United States and North Korea. There's more to it than that, yeah.
Anyone on the NPT? Jenny?
Well, not on the NPT, but on the first point.
We may not get that one answered.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is value to the relationship and to what's happening in the removing of the isolation. And I think, it actually it builds more leverage over time the more that North Korea finally has something to lose. I think the more they've been so outside of the system and already so, the pariah state to begin with, that, when you impose more and more sanctions, and they've already been under sanctions for so long, they've learned how to adapt to the sanctions regime. They see them coming, like these are not things that change their strategic calculus in the way that we want it to. But, once they start to have, trade again, once now they have a relationship at stake with China and Russia and Southeast Asia, for instance, where they are more likely to refrain from missile testing and provocations because they will lose that relationship if they do. The more points of contact and the more we can build that relationship, the more it will help with that process, because, the North Koreans have always looked at denuclearization as kind of the road to denuclearization is paved with a different political relationship. So we have to build the trust and cooperation first in order to justify disarmament. Not the way the U.S. looks at it is you have to disarm first and then we can have a different relationship. And so, at least what this process has done and what the Singapore agenda set up was this understanding that it all has to be done at the same time, because if you just have, security guarantees on paper, we're not going to attack you. How much trust do you have in that piece of paper?
Can I just add one other point here? I mean, this is a very important point that Jenny's making, that, if you step back from the details of these agreements, and details are important, I get that, but the overall concept here is to build positive leverage over North Korea, and it works. It can really work. And so, for example, when we had the 1994 agreement, which the North Koreans were committed to, I understand they were doing things they shouldn't have done, but overall they were committed to it. And our plan was to use that sort of growing positive leverage to fix the problems. And I think today we can have a similar plan if we start moving down this road, that we can create this leverage through a more positive relationship that allows us to work through problems. And unfortunately, I don't think most people view it that way, but I think it is a reality.
Gentleman in the front.
Tim Shorrock with The Nation magazine. When I was in Seoul covering the Pyongyang summit last September, and I remember when this announcement was made about they were thinking about dismantling the Sohae facility. It was basically laughed out of the room by the U.S. media and all the so-called experts here as nothing. This is no step forward whatsoever. And really, since then, the think tanks, posed from yours, and the media has basically said there's been no progress whatsoever and no concessions whatsoever on the part of North Koreans. Now we're told the Sohae missile facility is, first of all, they're calling it a missile facility, and this is a dangerous threat, and they've started it up, so this must mean a complete reversal, and we've got to go back. I mean, can you tell us precisely what you think the value of the Sohae facility is? Precisely. I mean, what is it designed for? What has it been used for? And how might they use it again? I understand it's only been used for satellite launches, not for missile testing. Thank you.
I can start, and I'm sure Jenny can add more detail. I've thought the same thing that you've been saying, which is how can everyone dismiss the importance of this site, and now that they seem to be rebuilding parts of it, all the alarm bells are going off. Am I surprised that that's the reaction? No. I'm not surprised, and I'm not surprised that people dismissed the importance of the place. It is a space launch center that was completed in 2011. There was a lot of work, a lot of money sunk into it. North Korea, contrary to what a lot of people think, has a serious space program. Hard to believe, but it's true. Secondly, it has been used for trying to put satellites in space, launching space launch vehicles. It has not been used for missile tests. The connection is, or has been, that in firing off space launch vehicles, there's a certain commonality in technologies between the space launch vehicle and a ballistic missile. They're not identical, though. So you could argue that you can use space launches as a way of developing some of the technologies that are useful for ballistic missiles. I should add that if tomorrow North Korea launched one of their typical space launch vehicles, which they fired off in the past, there's no longer anything they can learn for their missile program. They've already learned everything they can from that. Secondly, there's a rocket engine test facility where they can test engines that could be for missiles. So that part, they could be doing that if they restart.
Yeah, just to add some detail, it's funny because North Korea's space program and their satellite program is really a point of pride for them, and they feel it's their sovereign right for peaceful space exploration. But I think the idea that they were able to successfully launch a satellite into space before the South Koreans did it was a big win for them. And the amount of investment that they've built the Sohae satellite launching station, it was originally completed in 2011. They've done major upgrades to it over the years. It is sort of their showcase site. It's where they have their space center, showcase space center. So it was surprising when they were willing to dismantle this to begin with, because they've never characterized it as a missile facility. They've always characterized it as a space facility, and this has caused problems in the past, where if you had a moratorium on missile and nuclear testing, they would still go ahead with satellite launches because that wasn't a ballistic missile. And so this, the idea that they would be willing to dismantle this had a larger symbolic meaning that could have indicated that they were also willing then to give up their satellite program and their space launches, knowing that it's equally provocative to the outside world. Now that they're going back and reassembling it, I think, we do run into this issue again of, are they thinking they still might do this for whatever purposes? And again, how is that going to derail if there is positive progress in any kind of diplomatic process going forward? I would say too, but some of the criticism that was that it wasn't a big deal was that, for instance, the engine test stand there, of course, is not the only engine test stand that North Korea has, although it was the largest one and the one that they used for their largest liquid fuel engines. The launch pad that they have there is not the only satellite launch pad that they have. They do still have one over at the Sohae facility, but that one has been basically abandoned since about 2014 after they had successfully launched from the Sohae facility as well. So I think this was some of the discounting of the value of dismantling Sohae, was that these weren't the only capabilities, but it wasn't meant to be a comprehensive move either. It was meant to be a confidence-building measure on something they felt was very kind of showcase facility to help build, momentum for the political process.
I mean, the value was it closed this loophole that in the past has upset agreements we had with North Korea. The case in point was the 2012 so-called Leap Day deal, where they did a space launch, and that destroyed the deal because they had promised not to launch missiles. So this was a closing of the loophole and a sign to those of us who have followed North Korea that they might be willing to give up their space program, which I found really surprising.
In the front here.
Yeonji from Radio Free Asia, and I have a question regarding Dongchang-ri site. And did North Korea start rebuilding activities before the second summit or after the second summit? And do we have different interpretation of North Korea's intentions depending on the specific timing, like after or before the second summit?
So based on the imagery, and others have been looking at different sources of imagery as well, it does look like they started the rebuilding of these facilities before the summit, but shortly before the summit. I think we have an image from February 16th that we haven't published yet, but you started to see at least equipment being put in, pulled in. I think the majority of work happened after that. I think some that have been looking at planet imagery have said that they started to see more movement as of February 16th. And so it's sort of, in the week before the Hanoi summit. Again, what I take from that is that, they were frustrated and that they had made the decision that this unilateral measure was something that, they weren't getting what they wanted in that process. It was something that they were going to take back.
Anything else? Good. All the way in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Sujin Park with the Wilson Center. I very much agree with your mention of the need to build trust with small successes and also a modest agreement to move on. But given, like you mentioned also, Madame Che's mentioned that Chairman Kim seems to have lost appetite, and also Foreign Minister Lee Hong mentioning that this is our stance and will not change. And also in the U.S. as well, Security Advisor Bolton saying, this is what we want, and we've handed, what is required to North Korea. It appears at this moment that it'll take time for the two sides to maybe work on the details, because on surface, it's not going to work. And I'm hoping that they would be able to do something on the working level, behind the scenes, not public, but it will take quite a lot of time. And given the circumstances that President Trump is in, the political circumstances in Washington, we don't have that much of a time, I think. So what do you think would be a plausible timeline that would allow for this to move on and not lose steam? Because as Mr. Witt, you've also experienced the political environment as well as in the agreed framework changed dramatically and eventually led to collapse.
So I think, if I could summarize the question, I think it is, how much time is there to re-engage before momentum is completely lost in the process? And what are some small steps that could be taken to yeah. Chris, do you want to take a shot?
I'll leave domestic US timeline for others to explain. I think on the South Korean side, it's important to note that obviously there are legislative elections in April of 2020, and then Moon, of course, is a one-term president, but there will be a presidential election in 2022. He's facing a conservative side that has suffered enormously, obviously, with the impeachment of the previous president. So there is one side to this argument says that he's not under all that much pressure because he could probably win without even campaigning. But South Korean politics moves fast, and it is necessary, if we are concerned with maintaining momentum in this dialogue process on all sides, then we need to concern ourselves with the domestic political environment in South Korea as well as the North Korean and the United States side. For President Moon, if you look at opinion polling, when people say they view him favorably, they say they view him favorably for his North Korea policy. Not only that, but that's usually at the top of the list. When they say they view him negatively, they say it's related to the economy, pocketbook concerns. The pocketbook concerns are likely to get worse as the legislative elections come along. Therefore, if there can be some kind of modest deal on the US-DPRK side and then the US-DPRK-ROK side, if they could achieve the end of war declaration or something of this nature, that would be enormously beneficial for President Moon. So looking at the South Korean political calendar, those are the things I think we need to keep our eyes on.
Can I just add another angle to the question on timeline, too? We haven't talked much about the sanctions regime and the challenges of keeping in place commitment to the sanctions regime. Is there a time limit on that or a timeline on that, on the challenges of trying to keep all those who need to be committed?
This is a great question. Just a piece of historical analysis. Since I was involved in the implementation of the agreed framework, I don't see what happened to the agreed framework was a result of Republicans taking over Congress in 1994. The erosion of the Clinton administration's commitment started almost immediately after the agreement, when Secretary of State Warren Christopher committed not to spend more than $30 million a year in implementation, which was far short of what we really needed. So the issue becomes, in terms of the politics, what can Congress do to upset whatever President Trump is planning on doing or whatever agreement he comes up with? I think that, of course, I can't visualize that, but to the extent there are U.S. financial commitments, they could have an effect on that. Secondly, in terms of the sanctions, of course, Congress has a lot to say about U.S. sanctions. There are probably a number of U.S. sanctions that could be lifted without Congress stopping him. And certainly the UN sanctions can be rolled back by the Trump administration. Congress, I don't think, would have a lot to do with that. So, the bottom line here for me is it depends on the level of commitment by President Trump and Kim Jong-un to getting an agreement, and particularly whether President Trump can get together a coherent, organized decision-making process in Washington. Without, and that, of course, is a big if, right? Without that, I don't know if we can really get our act together over the next 2 years?
I think I'd add to that, and a lot of people talk about, well, North Korea's time horizon is so much longer, but I do think there is probably there's more urgency there than what there has been in past administrations in dealing with U.S. administrations, because Trump is willing to be unconventional. Obviously the North Koreans had a bad relationship with the Obama administration. I think, the writing's on the wall that the next administration is likely to go back to a harder line or a more traditional approach if it isn't Trump. And so I think there is a bit of urgency on the North Korean side, one, to deal with Trump and Moon when the conditions are favorable to having a deal. But also, they do have a sanctions issue. Sanctions do have, do make it harder for them to live up to the commitments that, that Kim Jong-un is telling domestically to his people as well, because he has also raised the stakes on how he envisions the North Korean economy evolving. And so he will need more and more international cooperation in order to do that. So, I don't think anyone has a lot of time right now, although, Kim Jong-un will survive past this president, either in the U.S. or South Korea, but I do think there's probably more urgency now than there normally is on the North Korean time horizon.
And I mean, to build
Go ahead.
on what Jenny just said, I mean, in Kim Jong-un's rhetoric of economic development is, of course, spread widely across the nation, right? He doesn't distinguish between groups in society. But in reality, there are groups in society that he does need to consider more seriously on a regular basis. And we, not merely because the sanctions that the North Korean side is demanding be removed, the sanctions imposed in 2016 and particularly 2017, that demand in and of itself could be taken as evidence of the effectiveness of those sanctions. But it's not only that tells us that there may be groups in Pyongyang in particular who are increasingly dissatisfied with the state of play vis-à-vis sanctions. And their dissatisfaction is likely to only increase with the fact that on the 22nd of December 2019, all North Korean laborers currently outside the country are mandated to return. So that's not a deal breaker, and even if North Korea's senior elites are dissatisfied with the Kim regime, it is by no means clear to me that they could leave even if they wanted to, because of the various circumstances on the Korean Peninsula. But nevertheless, it will, at a minimum, make it harder for the Kim regime to get elite compliance with government diktat, right? So it's necessary for them to consider these groups in particular, and in more detail than just sort of general statements of economic development or a wish for economic development. There's more to it than that.
Joel, the point you made about what led to erosion of the agreed framework and the U.S. decision to underspend seems like a very important lesson to bear in mind if and when there ever is a deal, given that the current administration's impulse for deal-making, and not only in North Korea, is motivated, at least in part, by wanting to spend less around the world, not wanting to spend more around the world.
Yeah, look, if you just step back and think about how much a denuclearization deal will cost, and if you're dealing with missiles, and some U.S. officials want to throw into the pot chemical weapons, biological weapons, it's going to be billions of dollars. And we're not going to be footing the bill. I mean, that is entirely predictable. So, yes, I mean, a lot of this is going to depend on having countries like South Korea and others pick up the bill to pay for this. And I think they would, but it's unclear at this
Yeah.
point.
Gentleman way in the back.
Hi, James Siebens, Stimson Center. I wonder what the panel would think about, in terms of small incremental deals, actually formalizing the one deal that seems like it's already been put in effect, which is the tacit freeze for freeze that Jenny, you mentioned earlier. What would be the benefits or the likelihood of being able to actually articulate what kinds of drills are acceptable and what kinds of tests are acceptable, if any? The military has discussed resuming small-scale exercises that are kept at a level that would not raise the attention, let's say, of North Korea. But that's a subjective process. And so it seems like there might be a benefit to articulating exactly what levels of activity on both sides are at acceptable levels. And what are the risks with that approach also?
Make freeze for freeze more concrete, useful or not?
You know, I think it probably would be useful. I would say, though, that I highly doubt that the North Koreans would be interested in negotiating that deal. Because, you know, especially for this idea of if Kim Jong-un is looking for shortcuts, this isn't a shortcut. This is it's a hard negotiation over something that's already in place, that, there isn't real tangible benefits to, other than we have clarification on, what we consider military drills and stuff. So I would be skeptical that it would go very far or be very attractive as a negotiating point.
And would anyone be interested here? I mean, would the Defense Department in particular be interested in?
Yeah, if it doesn't deal with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to negotiate it. I think we know what kinds of exercises would be a problem and which ones wouldn't. So, when we did this in the past with Team Spirit, we canceled the exercise where there are 500,000 guys running around the peninsula, and we made it into a series of smaller exercises. We didn't negotiate what size the smaller exercises could be. So I don't think it really warrants that kind of level of commitment.
And you could end up getting yourself into pretty hot water too with allies, because then you start to say, we are going to say to North Korea what kind of missile testing is okay. And what happens if you allow missiles that can reach Japan? South Korea is obviously right next door, and you're going to permit testing of missiles that can kill thousands of South Koreans, but then worry about missiles that can reach the United States. It's just a can of worms that you probably don't want to open.
Especially if you don't have to.
Especially if you don't have to.
Gentlemen.
Stanley Kober, how secure do you think Kim's position is? Because he's been purging a lot of people.
I'm not the person who follows North Korea every day, but the fact that he's been purging a lot of people doesn't really tell me that his position is not secure. I think his position is very secure. And people made the mistake from the beginning to underestimating how secure his position was. So in the beginning, everyone thought Jong Sung-taek, his uncle, was going to lead this council of elders, and he was just going to be a figurehead. Well, that didn't work out that way for Jong Sung-taek. So I think his position is secure, but that doesn't mean he can just do anything he wants. He has to pay attention to groups around him and what their interests are as well.
I think the fact that Kim could travel by train to Vietnam, stay there several days, conduct a state visit, travel by train all the way back, and not be concerned for his regime's well-being tells you a lot. But also if you look at literature on authoritarian regimes and their robustness, the first 5 years are the most dangerous, and he's out of those woods. So all the evidence, from my mind, is that he's in a very secure position. Also, as I mentioned with a previous question, it is not clear that even the most discontented member of his elite has anywhere necessarily to go because of the situation of the existence of South Korea and conditions in Northeast Asia more generally.
More questions? Gentleman on the far right, and then I'll come over here.
Thank you. Bill Pratt, just American citizen at this point. I'm struck by the fact that we have literally dozens of attributes about North Korea to consider and look at all the time. And yet we know virtually nothing about what the formation of the American policy internal to the U.S. is. I almost think that the only way we could possibly have any success is if Kim had some prior experience selling New York real estate, because that's the only model that Trump appears to return to time after time, and expect people to intuitively know the right things to do and the wrong things to do to pull the deal off. And given the fact that we're now literally on the start of the 2020 campaign period, I truly doubt that the issue of another summit or actually working the details of any large, serious peace process or denuclearization process or whatever process we might think, when we don't even have an idea of the depth that traditional expertise in the State Department is being brought to bear on all of these secondary level of issues which may turn out to be very crucial. You know, Trump is one of these people who acts pretty consistently over time. He wants to disregard anything that's a traditional way of doing things. He wants to sort of break the china a little bit to draw attention to himself. And it's really, in the end, all about him as opposed to a joint opposite party, U.S., a type of long-term commitment.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, in terms of insight into processes, I find the Trump administration more leaky than the Kim administration. But in any event, I mean, Joel, you said earlier on that, you know, there is a Trump administration policy, and it's a policy that there were some policy ideas from the period of the transition that you can trace through here, and there are obviously some serious professionals working within the administration to try to advance it.
But I think you're absolutely right. It's a personality-driven policy, and the personality, of course, who counts is President Trump. And so you've identified a number of his quirks, to put it kindly. And so that accounts for everything that's happened over the past 2 years, whether it's, you know, the initial period of diplomacy where they got Otto Warmbier out of North Korea, to the fire and fury period, to everything that's happened since that period. And so, you know, when I sit in Washington, I listen to all the experts saying, well, this isn't the traditional way you make policy. It's like, and it's not gonna be the traditional way because President Trump is President Trump. So the real estate mogul model is the right model. The second point I want to make, and I've wondered about this as I do my book project, is what were the North Koreans saying to themselves about President Trump? You know, someone mentioned earlier that they were interested in diplomacy as early as 2017. I would take it even further back. A week after President Trump was elected, and Jenny and I and some others met Madam Jae in Geneva. And they were interested in engaging the Trump administration. So, you know, I sort of try to imagine, what did the briefing book look like for Kim Jong-un the night that they told him this guy, Donald Trump, had won the election? What did the briefing book look like? What did they tell Kim Jong-un about this guy? Or even if they had a briefing book, because they were taken by surprise as well.
On the other hand, the extremely process-driven policy of the Obama administration
That's
didn't produce
exactly
any
right.
more result.
You know, that's part of my, I hate to keep going on about my book, but since I've been working on it for a year and a
You've teased
half.
us so much here.
That's exactly it. You have such a contrast between an Obama administration that was process-driven, meeting after meeting after meeting, you know, raking the coals, looking for embers on policies, versus the Trump administration, which is almost the exact opposite.
I would add that, you know, I'm sure Kim Jong-un has read The Art of the Deal, and probably
Right.
most of his advisors have also.
Except we know Trump didn't write that, so.
but to better try and understand Trump's negotiating style and to better be able to adapt to Trump's negotiating style. I think the North Koreans are very aware, again, that this is an unconventional president. They didn't have a good track record with a conventional president. And so I do think they do see it as an opportunity. They're willing to be transactional, but there's still mutual interests at play that have to be addressed in order to move forward, in order for it to be a good deal on either side.
Good. More questions? Gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Yusuke Ota with NHK Japan Broadcasting Corporation. I have a question regarding Punggye-ri site. So could you share your assessment how soon North Korea could start to rebuild Punggye-ri site? And if they started to rebuild Punggye-ri site, how do you see their message to Washington?
So when it comes to Punggye-ri, they've basically closed all of the tunnels. They did massive explosions at the openings of the tunnels, and they destroyed all of the support buildings. So if they were to try and reopen that site, there's at least one of the tunnel complexes that they wouldn't go back to. But there's, 3 other tunnel complexes that they could potentially, if they wanted to, re-excavate those, the openings of those tunnels. They would have to rebuild the support buildings as well, and all the structures that would be needed to support operations in that area, but they did leave the command center intact. So it's not impossible. It would take a while, and we would certainly see that level of activity on satellite imagery, but it would be a very troubling signal if they started to do that they would be, ready to working to be able to resume nuclear testing.
Look, as I said earlier, of course, I don't know for sure, but I bet you there's a file cabinet at Punggye-ri where they have a plan for reopening the site. And I don't know when they would put that into effect, and it would take some time to probably actually do it, but I'm sure the plan exists.
But the thing about Punggye-ri and the nuclear testing is that this is the part of the testing regime that most agitates the Chinese. And so, if they were to do that, the signal would be more to the China-North Korea relationship than directly to the U.S. relationship.
Any other questions? Gentleman in the second, third row here.
John Kelly, ex-State Department. Joel, you said, if I got it correct, that North Korea has already learned everything they can learn from their missile test launches.
Space launches.
Sorry?
Space launches.
I took that to mean missile test launches.
No, the space launch vehicle, the Yunha space launch vehicle.
So they still have a lot to learn then from their missile test launches.
Oh, absolutely. And if they have a bigger space launch vehicle, which people suspect, and they roll that out, they might learn from that about some things to improve their ICBMs. So, and if they start testing ICBMs, of course, they're going to learn a lot more too. So I'm sorry, I didn't quite mean to say that. If they roll out an Unha, which is their standard space launch vehicle, and fire it off, they're not going to learn anything from that.
Because they've already done it 3 times.
Yeah.
Well, that still leads to my next question, which is the key problem we have, it strikes me, is to keep the North Koreans from resuming those tests. The nuclear tests don't matter. The nuclear weapons like having a nice rock. It's only useful if you can throw it someplace. And the question then becomes, isn't it to our advantage to keep these talks going, even if we think they're not going to go anyplace, keep these talks going absolutely as long as we can keep them going, in the hopes that eventually we're going to find some way to counter their missiles, so that we can take that advantage that they now have and turning it into an advantage for ourselves.
Well, 2 points. First point, I think nuclear tests do matter. They're in the process of developing a hydrogen bomb, which is, of course, much more powerful. Nuclear tests will allow them to reduce the size of the warheads, which is much important in terms of the effectiveness of the missiles. So they do matter, and the missile tests matter too. You're absolutely right. On your second point about countering their missiles, that's a good question. I mean, the North Koreans, if they stopped improving their missiles, and we, in turn, are working on missile defenses, we've been thinking about different techniques for stopping the North Koreans from launching their missiles. We've been thinking about that for a while, but seriously since 2014. But I think the bottom line on that score, and I'm not a big fan of missile defense, is that even as we keep working and working on it, at the end of the day, and this was the conclusion near the end of the Obama administration, preventing any North Korean missiles or nuclear weapons from reaching the United States would be a giant roll of the dice. You just couldn't be sure. So if 2 or 3 missiles got through, that would still probably be unacceptable for us.
The thing about
Probably may be the wrong word. I guess, I was in the State Department too long. I see Ken sitting there, you never want to say definitely.
It would kind of be the biggest thing that ever happened.
Right, right.
Anyway.
The other thing about, you say nuclear tests don't matter. I suppose we would need to define mattering, but it's easy to forget that in 2017, there were serious people inside the United States government who believed that North Korea's next nuclear test could be an airburst test over the Pacific. Now, I don't know how likely that was. I mean, personally, I think the probability was quite low. But if we say North Korean nuclear tests don't matter, and then, well, that would really seriously matter, so.
Yes.
Doug Norton, unaffiliated. While we're talking about the possibility for doing unconventional things, is it possible that by continuing to pursue complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, we're sort of pushing on a door that's marked pull? In other words, that just isn't going to happen. I mean, one of the many things about this long ongoing negotiation at this point that seems very unusual is that we are, I think, for the first time ever, trying to get a nation which has an operational nuclear weapons capability to completely give up that capability. And it's hard for me, as a very old arms controller, SALT II, to imagine a condition under which the North would actually do that. So my question is, would we be better off to, while we're being unconventional, to walk away from that maximalist goal and pursue some of these intermediate goals that could make life less dangerous in that part of the world?
And just to add to that, I mean, in thinking about what's the most realistic goal is making North Korea become a responsible nuclear power, something that should be considered as a goal as opposed to denuclearization.
I guess I'm a hardliner on this one because I would never give up the goal of denuclearization because that's exactly what the North Koreans want you to do. That allows them to achieve their fantasy, which is to be like Pakistan, or you can name other countries. I would never give up that goal, but the point there is, of course, I don't expect it to happen overnight. So if, you have arms control experience, I used to work on the START Treaty and the INF treaties with Russia. And so the way I look at it is you have to keep that objective. It's always there in the negotiation, but you move towards it in phases. So for example, in 2013, in a meeting Jenny and I were in with Ri Young-ho and Madam Che, they laid out a phased plan for denuclearization that started with freezing, and the second phase was rolling back, and the third phase was denuclearization. We could talk about the definition of that third phase. They didn't get into that level of detail. But that's sort of the way I look at it, too. So I would never let them off the hook.
I would add to that, especially when the North Koreans are still talking about being committed to denuclearization. Like, why would you give up the goal when the North Koreans are still talking about being willing to negotiate that goal and building a narrative about denuclearization to their domestic audiences? I mean, the fact that Kim Jong-un talked about a commitment to denuclearization and some of the steps that they were taking during his New Year's speech, which is, meant to be for a domestic, audience as the primary audience. This is not what a typical, nuclear weapons state would say to their people. So, as long as they're still talking about it and they still see a path forward, again, it's going to take a long time and you have to be realistic about how you get there, but why would you give up that goal until, you absolutely had no more hope left?
Chris, anything to add?
Not only to say that I strongly suspect that a majority of people working on this issue in South Korea and the United States share your point of view, but they are not going to say so for the very good reasons that were just articulated by the people. Yeah.
We can take one more question before turning to the panel for any closing comments. Anyone?
So this is a little bit of a less lofty question. My name is David Welch. I'm just an unaffiliated observer. What, I guess for President Kim, what is your storyline?
Chairman Kim.
Chairman, whatever. Supreme Leader. What is your storyline on what happened to Otto Warmbier?
Well, I'm not going to put myself in his position on this one. This is difficult. I have no idea whether he knew what happened to Otto Warmbier or not. No idea. And yes, I think the standard thinking among many people is, of course he knew. I don't know if he knew. He may have known, he may not have known. I just don't know the answer. Would I take his answer to me at face value, like maybe President Trump seemed to take? No, I wouldn't take it at face value, but I don't know if we're ever going to know the answer to that question.
But I also think, Trump was put in kind of an impossible place by being asked that question because, with negotiations ongoing, there is a certain level of finessing that you need to do to not insult Kim Jong-un on the spot right after a summit where you didn't get a deal, but you're still trying to keep the door open for negotiations.
Okay. Going to ask each panelist to make any closing remarks that you would like to. Maybe Jenny, if you want to have anything to add, go in reverse order.
I think we've covered a lot
We've
already.
covered a lot of ground already.
Ground.
And if I could amend my remarks in saying a nuclear weapon landing on San Francisco would be a big deal.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Maybe if you could just end on a note of next 6 months, are you optimistic, pessimistic, status quo?
You go. I don't answer that question.
I'm probably the most pessimistic up here, given kind of how you already see things starting to spiral downward. In terms of, I think it's so hard to tell, again, with this administration, with the North Koreans, this isn't business as usual on either side. And so I think, pretty much anything could happen. But I think the longer it takes to get back to negotiations, the less likely we are to be able to get a result.
So in that sense, you see the summit as having, by not producing a result, having a distinct cost in
Deflating the process.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it seems to, under the best of circumstances, predicting the future on this issue is, of course, very difficult, although a lot of people do it. But in these circumstances where I feel this is a highly personalized process with President Trump and Chairman Kim, it's even more difficult. So I really don't know where it's going to go.
There are many ways you could look at the question. I think a 6-month time horizon, I don't think we'll see any dramatic deterioration. I think the way the summit ended, albeit without agreement, suggests that all sides would like at some point relatively soon to, at a lower level at least, have talks. But it is the case that Kim Jong-un was slightly embarrassed, I suspect, by what happened in Hanoi. That's not helpful. It's not helpful to embarrass anybody necessarily, but to embarrass a North Korean leader does have some repercussions domestically. But nevertheless, you said 6 months, and I think 6 months at least will be, largely speaking, okay.
And embarrassed because it was portrayed as Trump is the one who chose to walk away?
Yeah, turned away and left Kim behind. I don't know if that is actually the case or not, but that is.
But that's the characterization.
The way it's being characterized in some quarters, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I learned a lot. I hope everyone did too. And a round of applause for the panelists.